So this is kind of the exact opposite of glass cannons, but if you have somebody who's underpowered for whatever reason, like they chose a build that doesn't actually work
Yeah.
with what's getting thrown at them,
Mm-hmm.
or they should have grabbed +1 armor when they grabbed it, like when
Right.
when
But they
our
went for the three really weird artifact things that don't,
like
I got goggles now, and you're like, that doesn't actually help me, but
our
thanks.
previous GM in 3.5 finally gaining a +1 weapon at 14th level as a fighter kind of really killed his viability as a fighter. Should have got
Yeah,
that at 6th.
or as soon as possible.
Uh huh.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good question, right? So sometimes in your campaign, and I think every time in a campaign, at least every time we played,
Somebody's
you
lower.
got your min maxer, and then you got your and I'm not going to say this in a bad way. I mean, just your person who's not as obsessed with the rules as your min maxer is, right?
Or,
So they're not looking for how to break the rules. They're just like, look, I'm here to show up. I'm here to have a good time, whatever that
yep,
means. And I'm not looking to care if my fighter is the best fighter I could possibly make, or my cleric is the
yep.
best cleric, or my wizard is the best wizard. Like, I didn't make the best wizard in our last campaign because, not to be
Or,
mean, I was just there to be like, I'm just gonna play a
yes.
wizard and have a good time. And then the min max was like, you need to do this, this, and this. I'm like, so what happens if you have, so in a couple of ways, so we have kind of a new player to D&D, and so one of the things that you and I did is we created his spell list
Mm-hmm.
for as a cleric in a PDF so that he could quickly understand what his spells were because he was running a cleric like a fighter, which is what
Basically,
you're going to do.
basically Cliff Note version of, hey, instead of me hitting it with my mace here, let me quickly look at this
Like maybe divine power or
page
smite
of things
evil
and
or yeah,
name basically
yeah,
name how long it takes to cast,
yeah,
what does it do in a Cliff Notes version, and that's
yeah.
really all he needed
And the
on
page number for like if you need more
further. But it
information,
actually, instead of him not even thinking about spells,
it was always in there. It was
he
great.
always looked at it, so he's at least thinking about spells.
Right, which is makes sense. Like, because the problem is, like, with a spellcaster who's a good fighter, you could get to this. You could accidentally forget that you have good spells, right? You could,
It
or you do your two buff spells and you don't do anything else. I'm not understanding that
honestly,
there's a couple of other good spells you could
honestly,
do. You
it's
know,
always this hard thing of playing a frontline cleric or a frontline paladin who has
right?
spells. Is it better for me to cast a spell here, or is it better for me just to hit it? And that's always a toss
It's
up
a little
unless
hard.
you're a really good player who knows that.
Well, but I wouldn't say really good player. I would say a knowledgeable player on the
Knowledgeable,
rules.
knowledgeable player, at least in that class, on when to
Yeah,
hit it and when to do a spell,
exactly.
which takes time.
Absolutely. So in this scenario, you have, and I think we have this at all times. It's like you have people that are pushing the boundaries, and you have people that are not even thinking about the boundaries. They're struggling with their character, and I don't mean in a bad way. They're just struggling with it. So what do you do? So as a GM, I think your first step would be to remind them specifically at certain critical points, like, hey, do you know your character actually has the ability to do other things? So
Mm-hmm.
for the cleric who's playing like a fighter, you could just say, hey, your guy actually can cast a lot of good spells. You may want to just see what you loaded up really quick.
Yeah.
Or, hey, tomorrow when you go to load up, you might want to load up a little bit more damage spells because you actually can do a lot more stuff than you think you're able to
Yes.
do. So I would start there with a gentle prodding with that. I kind of like what we ended up doing, which took some time on our part, but I mean, you
Mm-hmm.
can find online resources as well. We did, we just didn't like them as much. You could find free online resources that you could hand to the player
Mm-hmm.
and say, hey, maybe this will help you out. I think if you do it in a way that's not condescending, where you're just like, hey, this character also has the ability to do X, Y, and Z. Here's a sheet on all those things.
Yeah.
You might want to look into it. Then I think if it's still not kind of sinking, I would look at it as just because they're a new player and they're not understanding everything. At that point, it might be really good to just kind of have a sit down and let them know, hey, there's a couple of rules that you may not be aware of that
Mm-hmm.
you could be taken advantage of or things of that nature that could help you. I would do everything I could to provide as many supplemental helps as I could.
Yes.
The last thing I would do, and this is an option,
Mm-hmm.
but the very last thing I would do would be to give them more magical items or more special
Yes.
items than anybody else, just because you realize, like, okay, you're just going to run your fighter, you're going to run your cleric as a fighter, so I better be giving you like +3, +4 weapons because you're not going to use your magic. It's like, well, that's not the solution.
No, it
The
isn't.
solution is to get them to realize, like, your character is so much more than you think they are.
Mm-hmm.
I would actually suggest that they would go back and read. And let's just be honest, if you're playing something like a D&D, the chapter on a cleric is like 4 pages. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we're not talking like maybe like what, maybe 1,000 words. I mean, we're not talking like a tome, right? I'm not asking you to
Yeah,
read
no.
like all of Game of Thrones or something to figure out how to play your player. I mean, the other thing too is if you're doing GURPS or something, it gets a little bit more complex because your character's kind of all over the place. And if
Mm-hmm.
that was the case, I would look at like, okay, what are your defects? What are your strengths? So if your strengths, if your skills are in like, let's say your skills are in more of the physical combat thing,
Mm-hmm.
why are you always trying to be the face of the group and trying to do the parlay and the
Yep.
diplomacy and the intimidation? Why aren't you, letting that other player do that and you pull back for the fighting?
Mm-hmm.
Or if it's vice versa, right? You're more of the face, you're more of the diplomat. Why aren't you getting out there more?
Mm-hmm.
And then with GURPS, what I really like is because of the defects. How are you playing your defects, and how
Yep.
has that shaped your character as a person? And I think that's the big problem I have with D&D in general. And I think it might hurt some of these newer players, believe it or not, is that they don't have. I think D&D lends itself really well to just throwing dice on a table.
Yes.
It's less of a role playing game and more of a like a role playing video game where there's really no role for you to take. There's a couple of dialogue options, but for the most part, your goal is to get the biggest, baddest armor, weapon, magic,
At least,
whatever.
at least
and go to
that's
town.
how we play it. But that's also how the pre-made modules are. So if
Yeah.
you're used to growing up on the pre-made modules, and then your DM kind of
Well,
shifted from
especially
pre-made,
from like the D&D 2.0 days that are like
Mhm.
then migrated
like
through.
I know that D&D,
It's all about just
I know that
Slaughterhouse.
5e is currently in the works on their first module that doesn't have this trope of going out and killing everything
Oh.
right now.
Wow.
So, but it still took
So 2021 to like what 1970 something.
Yeah.
So longer than I've been alive.
like
you
there
know.
are role-playing Dungeons and Dragons, but they're
Yeah.
few and far between because the rules are really designed for dungeon crawls.
Exactly.
That's all it really is designed for. You
Yeah.
can do other things in it, but it's harder pressed to do that than like a GURPS or a
Yeah.
vampire.
So I mean, maybe that's the
So-
thing you could institute as a house rule, though.
So then
You know, is look at like name like I mean really like okay name 3 vices,
Mhm.
name 3 virtues, right? Because even let's just be honest, the D&D like backgrounds are kind of interesting if you do them, but for the most part they're not really defining who your character is. They're just kind of defining what happened to your character and maybe a driving force, but not a driving character.
Well,
Right, where you could look at it and go, "Hey, look, my character will stab people in the back, but he has a code of honor for his friends." Okay, cool,
they-
that helps.
they also tied the background to some of your skills and some of your tool proficiencies.
Yeah.
So you're now more choosing your background less from a roleplay perspective, but more from a stats perspective.
Yeah, which makes you want to min max it even worse.
Mhm.
I just think it'd be interesting to do. I think even though if your player's being underutilized, I think a lot of it might be because they don't understand how to play the character.
Either that or
And I don't mean from a rules perspective.
Yeah.
I mean from like what am I supposed to be doing right now?
and the other thing I would also another reason why they might be
Yeah.
is they were pushed to be a rogue
Right,
because
'cause we needed a
traps,
rogue.
we always needed a
We need a
rogue.
rogue.
And
don't
from a
wanna be a
DM
rogue.
perspective, you might not want to deal with traps because traps are really hard to run and they're really not fun for the rogue, honestly.
They're not fun for anybody.
Because
roll. Oh,
Roll.
you disabled it. Yay. Oh, you
Or-
set it off. Roll again.
or you die because
Oh.
normally most pre-mades give you the most deadliest
Yeah.
traps.
Yeah. it's
And they're in
save
weird
versus death.
places. So you have your rogue because he's itching to actually use the whole entire reason why he chose the rogue.
Was to finally unlock a
But
door.
no door's ever locked. No
No.
door's ever trapped.
No.
Except a handful of things that is always
Well,
a glyph of death.
And we covered that in terms of like the easiest thing to get rid of in your campaign is a rogue.
Yep.
And let them do anything other
But-
than that.
But if
So
they were thrown into the rogue role because there was some traps,
because you're
and
playing a pre-made.
it's not nearly as much as you think.
We're playing a pre-made and we're going through Tomb of Horrors.
It might be this thing of
Great.
going through
Yeah.
and going, hey, I noticed you're not engaging or
Yeah.
you're underpowered compared to the rest of them. What can we do? Why do you think that is? And
Yeah.
it very well might be, hey, why don't you walk back this feat, this feat, and
Yeah.
this feat, or
It's a good
walk
idea.
back some of your class roles and drop them into other areas. And we might be able to make a weird hybrid thing where,
Yeah.
since you're not using your trap finding as much, you've specialized into other fields that
Right.
allows you to be more useful.
I think it's a good idea. Like, if you get 3 or 4 levels in and you realize this is just not working, I think the DM should be sufficiently flexible enough to say, oh, you chose this feat, or you chose this prestige class, or you chose this way of going, and it's just not working out for you. How about we do this? How about you pull that back and you figure out something else to do, and we'll just retroactively fix your character from that point to now. And I think it'd be fun. Look, here's the thing I see. And maybe this is just because I play Vampire the Masquerade too many times, where they were like, the rules are less than the story you want to tell. And so if somebody's not having fun, I would rather sacrifice rules and get them to have fun than I would to be like, well, this is the rules, deal with it.
5e's heavily pitched that you're the arbiter.
Yeah, so
throw rules
it.
out for story if needed.
Change it, absolutely. And I think that's maybe it. Maybe you need permission to change your game. I'm giving you permission to change your game.
Yep.
And if you have a rules lawyer, which always happens, so, I mean, maybe not always, but I have a rules lawyer too in our group. And the answer would be, I just look at them and go like, well, you know, the number one rule is to have fun. So that's what we're going to do first. And if it works with the rules, great. And if it doesn't, we'll change those rules.
And having one person a little less engaged than the rest could actually bog down and take down your campaign.
Really, so much so.
So you could also mention to that rules lawyer, if he's DM'd a little bit, hey, he's not having fun, so if I don't change this,
we're losing him.
We're losing this campaign.
Right, exactly. So hopefully that's given you some ideas on how you can take some of the lower level players and bring them up. It looks like a lot of advice, maybe rolling the character back several levels and having them choose different things so they can play better. At the end of the day, though, try to have fun, try to engage your players, make sure they're having fun. It's not the DM's responsibility for the player, to 100% that the players are engaged. But if the DM does nothing to make sure the players are engaged, that's the DM's fault. So there needs to be a balance there where everybody's taking ownership of being engaged. And if you're seeing that someone's not utilizing their character to the fullest extent, chances are it's going to lead to boredom or something else, confusion, at least not having fun. Do what you can to fix it, because honestly, you'll have a better game for that. And we'll see you next time.